Oh, Rainsford, I do get so very tired of terrible public domain transfers and transfer problems with the most dangerous game. It's beginning to bore me. How I wish there could be one release to give me back the thrill of the hunt. Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. I'm going to be reviewing Eureka's Masters of Cinema Blu-ray release of the 1932 classic The Most Dangerous Game, directed by Ernest Schoedsack, also with Irving Pierschel, and produced by Merian C. Cooper. Of course, those names should be famous to any film fans. Of course, Cooper and Schoedsack at the same time were making King Kong, which would be released the next year in 1933. It's impossible to escape the Kong connection because, of course, the Most Dangerous Game uses the same legendary Skull Island sets, and it was produced, again, at the exact same time. So it's sort of the sister film. It even features notable members of the same cast, including Fay Wray and Robert Armstrong, along with Noble Johnson even. So it's an incredible film that unfortunately often gets overshadowed and overlooked by its much more famous larger brother in King Kong. And in some ways, it's actually a stronger film because it's so ridiculously tight. That refers to both the story and the insanely short runtime. The film is 62 minutes long. Originally, it was a bit longer, at probably about more like 75 minutes. But in cutting it down and paring down everything to its barest essentials, and of course, it's based on the famous Richard Connell short story, which is one of the most famous short stories in all of literature, that you've most likely read in an English class or a story anthology at some point. The way this film is able to improve upon the original story and have a better ending and do it all in a ridiculously tight and short 62-minute runtime, I think this is one of the key films that you should study in film schools. I think this film should be studied for its pacing. It is one of the most ridiculously well-paced and well-developed films in a short runtime you will ever see in your life. Again, this should be studied for how well it's able to tell a story, improve upon that story material, add to that story material, and have an actual satisfying ending, because the short story really doesn't have one, and do it all in 62 minutes and be full of creative energy and be actually produced at the same time they're trying to get King Kong off the ground with the legendary game-changing Willis O'Brien special effects, which were what was causing a bit of a holdup. So while they're trying to get that going, they actually turned around and made an actual other masterpiece classic in its own right in The Most Dangerous Game. So I really hate that this film is so little discussed, or especially compared to King Kong. It also hasn't been helped by the fact that it unfortunately fell into the public domain a great number of years ago. So this film has been cursed by terrible public domain transfers and presentations for years. There have been multiple attempts to restore it. This release is using the German restoration from from a couple years ago, about 2018, I think it was. That was done for a limited Blu-ray release and then sold out very quickly. And it is, I think, visually the best restoration to date. So picture quality wise, this is a significant leap forward, even over Flicker Alley's attempt from, I think, about 2011, 2012 on their expensive Blu-ray. A lot of the restorations are stuck using print sources, so they're not going to be damage-free, they're not going to be issue-free. Unfortunately, this film has never had the full overhaul, complete frame-by-frame 2K or 4K restoration in terms of sort of like a top-tier, ultra-expensive restoration. I do think it deserves it, and I think at some point that should happen, so hopefully we can maybe finally have a definitive release. I was hoping that would happen here on the Eureka release, because I had not gotten to see the German restoration, because again, their Blu-ray was very expensive. You had to import it, and it was limited to only 1,000 copies, so it sold out almost overnight. So that was I was really mad at myself that I hadn't tried that. And then a couple years went by, and I figured nobody was going to attempt working on this film again. But thankfully, Eureka was able to license that master and to commission new extras and make what I think is currently the definitive video presentation in almost all areas, and I'll get to why I say almost when I get to the audio side of things. So to talk a bit more about the film, This is a film I've loved ever since the first time I saw it. It again is based on the Richard Connell, I should say, probably infamous short story. That it's so infamous because even if you've never read it, you know the story of the hunter basically deciding he's so bored with things that he has his own private island where he started hunting human beings because they're the only challenge he has left. This idea has been ripped off so many times that it's sort of soaked itself into pop culture, and you see it pop up all over the place in different ways. It's been done to death. There are even brand new, films that have been sort of inspired by it. It's an idea that never goes away because it's such a great central concept that, again, it's been done on television, it's been done in radio, it's been done, it's been rewritten many different ways, and that sort of idea injected into other stories. So it's been done to death, but it's such a great concept that the idea remains alluring somehow, and the story is always fascinating. I think my own personal favorite, if I had to name the other version that I actually really like that is doing a most dangerous game scenario, is actually in the series of darker late '80s books of the Hardy Boys Case Files, where they reinvented the classic children's mystery series as a darker late '80s run for older teenage readers, and very much trying to do like adventure pulp men's paperbacks. So in volume 7, they did a book entitled Death Game, where after a rather nice setup that gives a different spin on the story, the boys find themselves in a most dangerous game scenario on a deserted island, where this is what the crazy ex-army colonel does to relive sort of his special forces days, and it's used as a sort of training scenario with people actually getting killed, so they have to use their wits and survive. And it's interesting because, of course, they're still teenagers, so it gives a different spin on the story a little bit. That's my own personal favorite to take, but again, it just shows you, that was done in the late '80s, so it's a story that keeps on giving because everybody keeps riffing on it or stealing from it or reworking it. But this film, this 1932 film that Cooper and Schoedsack made, it is the definitive adaptation. Nobody's ever done it as well. RKO would later go on to remake it in the 1940s with Robert Wise and under the title Game of Death. It was also remade as a film later on many, many different times, but no one's ever done it as directly or as succinctly or as good as this version, which again does improve upon the short story by not only actually having a legitimate ending that is great and dramatic and really gives you a satisfying conclusion, which is not in Connell's short story. I think it's one of the most frustrating endings in all of literature because, yeah, it kind of sort of works, but it is just not satisfying at all because there really isn't an ending. It just stops, and then there's that one little line, Rainsford had never slept in a better bed, and you're like, seriously? I've never gotten over that. But it also has a love interest who is not just dropped in, but is played by the always amazing Fay Wray. So, of course, there's your King Kong connection. But she actually manages to add another element to the story by being there, by having this character, because then you have Rainsford, who's played by the forever underrated Joel McCrea in one of his, I think, most iconic film roles. But that gives Rainsford something more to fight for, and it allows for a nice romance to develop because he has to protect her from the villainous Count Zaroff, played by Leslie Banks, which is amazingly his first film performance, and he's absolutely incredible. I think it's one of the great iconic classic villain performances in cinema, and of course it's a great villain from the original short story. But they add a sort of very PreCode sexual element to the story because Zaroff mentions very vividly that he has no desire in all of life's aspects, including sex, unless it's able to be tied to the thrill of the aftermath of a successful hunt. So, of course, the inference being that he goes out on his next hunt, and his prize for winning will, of course, be the poor girl that's stuck here as sort of essentially as a physical trophy to be possessed. And this also adds to the complete mental breakdown of this character. It makes him even more fascinating. And of course, as he's saying this, he's fondling his gigantic head scar from the water buffalo, and it's a very sort of wonderfully diluted, sort of creepy physical touch. So the film is filled with little additions like that. Probably the most infamous and the most grisly of these is the trophy room scene, which unfortunately was one of the things that was victim of being cut from the film. And this is where the film definitely crossed over into being a horror film, because it is described as being a horror film, and people go and see it, and they might think it's more of an adventure film or it's based on the short story, but it definitely has the pre-code horror elements. And the trophy room scene was really the standout, because they go there and it's where the actual depths of Zaroff's madness are revealed, because they go in and there's all the preserved heads on the wall of human beings and heads in a jar. And there was this great scene. I think it's one of the great scenes of cinema that I dream of finding. It's like the spider pit scene in King Kong as well, that you read about, and it just sounds amazing. But of course, it was removed for being too intensive. But in the original cut of the film, you had Zaroff going around lovingly discussing and describing each trophy in turn. One in particular was a preserved corpse with some of Zaroff's dogs that he managed to kill, and he's preserved it in this action scene, and he describes lovingly to Rainsford, who's tied down, about how this man almost won the hunt. It was glorious, so I have him preserved here in my trophy room. And it's just wonderfully morbid and macabre. We have bits of that left in the film, but when they get to the trophy room, that's where we go full on into horror film territory. But there are little sprinklings of that throughout, and also incredible bits of creativity. The film, of course, opens with Rainsford, the big game hunter, on a boat, and of course the boat is wrecked. There's a bit of fun dialogue about how Rainsford will never have to be on the other side of the hunt himself. So of course that's why he feels entitled to be a hunter. And of course it's famous last words, and rather amusingly so, because you know where this is going to go. But Cooper and Schoedsack managed to make an incredibly effective sinking sequence, and they do it all with really next to nothing. They really use the power of editing and suggestion. I think this particular sequence is another key example. I mean, the whole film should be studied in a film school setting. It is that brilliantly constructed and brilliantly edited to be as tight as humanly possible. But the sinking of the boat sequence is done by a lot of fast cuts, a lot of suggestion, a lot of things are happening off screen. But then you also have the intensity factor get raised by the survivors clinging to the bits of the charred boat that are left in the water, and then all of a sudden they get attacked by sharks. So you have guys are getting eaten by sharks, and it's just as wonderfully pre-code morbid as the similar sequences in King Kong, where you have Kong stepping on guys. You have the great bit of the sailor being plucked out of the tree by the brontosaurus. Well, here you have guys getting attacked in the water and eaten by sharks. So, what's not to love? So it's a really intensive little sequence that's how Rainsford gets washed up on the beach. And in one of the story's great improvements over the short story, it's revealed that Zaroff himself is purposely directing ships off course by messing with the sort of channel lights. And so when there's a ship nearby, he decides, okay, well, I'm gonna have that one, and then he actually purposely shipwrecks ships and causes all the deaths to then have the survivors wash up on his island, so then he can indoctrinate them into his mad hunt scheme. It's another example of the film really improving the short story by giving characters more definite actions, making them feel a bit more three-dimensional, and adding to the atmosphere and the darkness of the story by making Zaroff even more of a villain. But Banks plays him so well and with such a sense of culture, and also a really great Russian accent. They did have apparently a dialect coach there as well to make sure his accent was good. It's interesting that Zaroff is sort of an otherworldly type figure, because he basically left before the Russian Revolution and has just wandered around the world, and this is his own little private refuge he's set up with the fortune that he was able to squirrel away. But he's doing this because he doesn't really like the world anymore because he's bored by hunting. So he has a sort of there is I think a definite Captain Nemo type, Jules Verne ish feel to Zaroff and his sort of otherworldly jungle island where he's built this lovely sort of miniature mansion in the midst of the jungle and just does this insane hunting all the time. But it's just an incredible film that keeps you wanting more, and it moves with such an incredible energy that when they actually do get to the hunt sequence, which is the main bulk of the film, the whole film has built up to that point that you get to that feeling in terms of the driving forward of the plot. It feels like everything's about to boil over, and then when they're just turned loose into the jungle, it does, and that's when the intensity just ramps up, and it increases as they become more and more frenzied, more and more tired, more and more worn down. Their clothes get torn, they get bloodied, they get battered. They try to come up with various ways to stop Zaroff. They try to set traps. Things don't work, and things become increasingly panicked. And so you, the viewer, become just as invested in the experiences of our poor periled couple trying to escape Zaroff and survive long enough to quote unquote win the hunt, which Zaroff claims he will let them go, and of course, so we don't believe a word that he's saying. But the pacing of the film is such that you're not really allowed a moment to breathe. You're put right smack dab in the middle of the jungle with our two heroes, and you're just as breathless as they are trying to survive. And the film is incredibly well put together, so much so that pace never lets up. And once we finish the jungle sequence and you get to the point in the actual original short story where it's just sort of tossed off and you're left disappointed by the ending, you get a little bit of a breather there, and then we go into what the film invents for the ending, which is extraordinarily satisfying and does have some nice pre-code grittiness to it. There's that one particular moment of a particular sound effect that still is really satisfying and amazing they got away with, and of course, really only because it was a pre-code film. And it manages to have a really wonderful, dramatic, satisfying conclusion to the story that is the single biggest improvement upon Connell's original short story, and I think is the real point at which that you know for a fact you're now seeing the best version of the story that's ever been realized. No other version of this story has ever been as good, as well put together, as well edited, as well written and developed as this 1932 original film from RKO. It remains the definitive adaptation of this story. It is one of the great pre-code classics. It has standout iconic performances, but it all takes place on the amazing, iconic Skull Island sets. So you can't help but think, if they turn the wrong corner, there's going to be Kong there asleep, or they're going to run into dinosaurs. They even have the iconic log that they run across over the chasm that, of course, in Kong is the log, or I should say the fallen tree, that Kong himself picks up and shakes the sailors off where they fall into what was the spider pit sequence. So this is a must for Kong fans. Kong fans probably already know it like the back of their hand, as you should. So really it's part of a sort of trilogy. You have Most Dangerous Game, King Kong, and then Son of Kong. And that's basically like the original Skull Island trilogy, I guess. Those sets are really the most iconic jungle sets in all of film history. So to have another 62 minutes in the Skull Island sets, but doing the best version ever done of the Most Dangerous Game is just... it's one of those magical film experiences. It never gets old. It's never lost any of its energy. It's one of those magic little films that if you've never seen it before, you're going to be asking yourself, why the hell have I not seen this before? And unfortunately, the public domain history is kind of played into that. So if you see it, it's never going to be pristine looking, and if you've seen it before in the past, you've probably seen it looking like absolute crud because of just the very poor way it's been treated over the years in terms of the elements. So that brings us to Eureka's Masters of Cinema Blu-ray. Now, before this point, there's only been a handful of releases that have been worth your time, and they've been, the more official releases. So, really, all you have is Roan's lovely Laserdisc from the 90s. Then Criterion did a DVD in the early 2000s, which was a little bit of an improvement. And then Legend Films did, unfortunately, a colorized version, but their black and white presentation was okay. Then in the Blu-ray realm, there was Flicker Alley's presentation, which seems to have been from either a fine-grained print or some type of element like that. It even had the rounded corners, but it was also pretty solid, but unfortunately had some issues of its own. And then the fifth version was this German restoration that came out, again, I think at about 2018, and then that sold out in like 5 minutes, and it was a big visual improvement over the previous releases. So basically, there are only 5 releases before this point that you should even pay attention to, because everything else was public domain junk. This film has had terrible treatment over the decades because it fell into the public domain. So what Eureka did was they were able to license that German restoration, which is visually, in terms of the picture restoration and presentation, the best to date. So to talk about the picture quality, this again is that German restoration. It is unfortunately not a full frame-by-frame restoration, so it does have a lot of baked-in issues. You're going to notice ticks, specks, scratches, bits of damage. For the most part, it's never very intrusive, but there are some big notable bits of damage you're going to come across. There's also some changeover cues baked in, which it seems to indicate this was some sort of it's claimed as a German lower generation source, like a German interpositive or German negative. So apparently it might go all the way back to being a foreign export negative. It does have really great quality, and I think the big improvement over previous releases, particularly that Flicker Alley release, which did seem a bit bright. Here, the black levels seem really nice, and it is visually the best I've ever seen the film look. So I was very pleased that I'm finally getting to see this German restoration. It is extremely well encoded, as Eureka always does. So I don't have a problem with it visually. I think visually this is the best you're ever going to see the film, unless somebody does a full frame-by-frame restoration in 4K of the best source that's available. So do go into this knowing it does have some baked-in damage to the source. It's really inescapable with this film due to its treatment, and I would guess the original negative is long gone by this point. But I do think visually this is an improvement over all prior editions, and you will constantly find yourself being wowed by the image quality, especially if you're like me, seeing all the crappy versions over the years. So you're not going to mind a bit of damage and things in there, because you're used to it with this film. If you've grown up with it like I have, or if you've seen it in the past on any version, you're going to expect some damage somewhere, because it's just always been that way. But it's never been as good looking as this version. So I do think Eureka was wise in licensing this German restoration, because again, I think it is the best picture quality of any version to date, aside from the baked in issues to the source element. Now we come to the audio portion, and this is unfortunately where I do have a bit of an issue. Well, I shouldn't say a bit of an issue. It is a major issue. And this isn't anything that Eureka did. When you get to the audio, there are 2 options. Both are lossless mono, as Eureka does quite frequently with their releases. But it's credited as being a restored audio mono option and then an unrestored mono audio option. So you get a choice between the 2, and you might wonder, well, why would you have a choice? I myself have always pushed for studios and labels doing this more often, so that way you could have an option when the restored audio is overcleaned or has too much noise reduction and has been overprocessed. So I think when available, it should always be given as a secondary option to have the untouched audio. Here, they've done it, and it's extremely important, because the restored audio, and this seems to be entirely down to the German restoration team who originally did this. I don't own the German disc, so I can't say for sure, but I'm almost 100% sure that this is tied to this same German restoration for the picture. The restored audio option here What apparently they've done is they went in and they didn't just clean up the track, they didn't just do noise reduction, but they went to town on the noise reduction because all you hear is the dialogue, the sound effects, and the music cues. There is almost no hiss. It's been so aggressively noise reduced that you only have the faintest bit of hiss when there's actual dialogue, music, or sound effects. And so everything thus feels so naked and like it's by itself in terms of the sonic landscape that there's almost no natural noise floor anymore, so it feels very unnatural. It's very jarring. So anytime there's a sound effect, like in the opening on the ship, you'll notice it. That's a good point to check because you have people moving plates around and getting up out of chairs and lighting cigars and just moving around as they naturally would. But in this restored track, all the sound effects are isolated. All the dialogue is isolated. So it's very jarring, it's very unnatural. And then you can, if you listen closely, you can barely hear some bits of the natural noise floor under the heavy noise reduction. But it also by making everything feel so unnatural, it's also removed some of the range of the actual effects and dialogue themselves and the music as well. So it's really terrible. I would never recommend listening to this audio track. It's been over scrubbed within an inch of its life. And yes, it's clean. Yes, it has some restoration applied to it, so you don't have pops and dropouts. But it's terrible. And that's why I'm so relieved Eureka included an unrestored option. So if you get this disc, always watch it with the unrestored track. The problem is, by unrestored, it means literally it does not have any work done to it at all. So you've got pops, ticks, scratches, heavy amounts of hiss and wear. This is, it sounds very much like what you get on all the previous releases, like the Criterion and the Roan Group disc especially. So for people who know this film, that's going to be something you're familiar with. But the real issue with the unrestored track is there are some dropouts, particularly in music cues at scene transitions. So there are a couple spots you'll notice where, unfortunately, there's a dropout, so there's no audio. So I wish there had been an option to have the restoration of the actual dropouts and things, like the actual technical restoration parts, without the heavy-handed noise reduction application. So it's great that we have the unrestored option so you can actually watch the film with an audio track that isn't horrible, but you do have to watch it with the inherent problems of the source they transferred. It also seemed, I'm not entirely 100% sure, but it did seem like there also might be a handful of minor sync issues with the unrestored track. I don't know if that's because it was just somehow messed up in the encoding process, or my guess is that when they restored the audio first and separately from the picture, and then they synced their restored track to their restored picture, and then didn't pay the same exact attention when this German restoration was done to the unrestored option. So I think it's kind of a miracle that we even have this unrestored option, and Eureka included it, because the German disc didn't have this at all. So I definitely feel, while the unrestored option is definitely the warts and all audio approach, it is the way to go with this, because the restored track, and again, restored in air quotes, it's one of the most over-aggressive uses of noise reduction I've seen in a long time. And it's so bad I noticed it right off the bat. I knew something was off, and I kept pausing and rewinding over and over, and then I decided to switch over to the unrestored track, and then immediately it was like, oh, that's what they did. Oh boy. They didn't just remove excess noise. They removed like every bit of the noise floor they could get is gone. Every bit of hiss they could get out is gone. So the dialogue, sound effects, and music is really in your face and actually a bit clipped, because they just went through and just took out giant swaths of the original waveform. So even though it's got dropouts, even though it might have one or two little bits of sync issues and it's got pops and everything and crackle throughout, go with the unrestored option. And because the picture isn't pristine, it makes the unrestored audio a bit more appropriate. It doesn't feel too far off because, again, the picture does have those baked in defects. So it's unfortunate that we have to deal with this, but with this film having such a poor release history and such disparate elements all over the world, it's kind of a miracle we can have any sort of improvement. So that's my big holdup with this release, because you do have to go with the unrestored track, because the restored track is just garbage. It's awful. It's terrible. And it's one of the most glaringly obvious examples of overzealous noise reduction I've seen in a very long time. So just don't bother with it. The unrestored track has problems, yes, but it is a far better experience and much more intrinsically appropriate to 1932 than the god-awful restored track. So now let's talk about the packaging of the deluxe Spine 269 Masters of Cinema release. We first have the beautiful limited slipcover that gorgeously uses the original promotional art of Zaroff's Island, so depicting all of the various areas and the path that our heroes find themselves having to take to survive, and then lovingly reproducing the original bits of text. So this is the literal part of the actual promotional campaign from 1932, and it's a beautiful inspired touch for the art. Their slipcovers are always really well done. They're very thick and sturdy as well. Then the rear detailing the bonus features and keeping the same lovely color from the front. Then the case itself uses more original poster artwork, really nice and colorful with the Masters of Cinema banner. Then the rear in their traditional style. The interior has the disc with matching label, and then the lovely limited edition booklet, which is filled with beautiful stills. If you see this image and it does not make you want to immediately go and see this film, I don't know what's wrong with you. This is one of the great adventure films ever made, and it's also an adventure horror PreCode classic. So it is one of those must-see experiences that never gets old. This has lovely new essays, this one by Craigie and Mann, and then the really nice important one is by George Turner, who does a long write-up on the film. He's been really the primary historian talking about this film for years. And of course, this covers some of the same ground that he did in his Roan Group Laserdisc commentary, which is also really excellent. So it's great to have that here. The essays go over a lot of the production of the film, its whole production history, and of course the public domain history that's sort of cursed it ever since. Then there's Eureka's lovely usual technical notes, and I always love their note about actually turning off motion smoothing on your TV and making sure you display the correct aspect ratio. Then the interior of the limited edition, we have another original poster highlighting the trophy room, and then the ultra creepy shot of the wonderfully villainous Leslie Banks as Zaroff. So a beautiful internal art touch to this. So to talk about the extras, it mentions this is the 2K restored scan of a German 35mm dub negative. So that is the Wicked Vision German master I've been talking about. Optional English subtitles. There's a new audio commentary with Stephen Jones and Kim Newman, another of their great classic duo tracks. So they literally conclude with, as soon as the film's over, they want to watch it again because they love it so much, which is kind of the feeling you always have when you come to it. So it's a really great track, even for someone like me who's heard the previous commentaries. So it's another great enticement to buy yet another edition of The Most Dangerous Game. Then there's a separate Kim Newman interview in the same sort of wonderful style as his other interviews on various releases. So those were always nice, lengthy, and talk about the whole history of the project and the different adaptations. So it's another great piece. Then there's an interview with film scholar Stephen Thrower on The Most Dangerous Game. Another nice, pretty lengthy interview piece. Again, always great to have more of those. Then there's an entire bit of actual Merian C. Cooper interview pieces that were collected for for archival purposes, and those are fascinating to hear because both Cooper and Schoedsack, who were lifelong friends, they had fascinating lives before they ever got into films. So hearing his recounting of parts of their histories and then talking a little bit about this film are just incredible. And if you've never read up on their histories, it's just they're a movie in and of themselves. There should be a book about both of them because they literally lived dozens of lives before they got into films. So that's fantastic. And then we also have 3 separate radio adaptations of the Most Dangerous Game story that do take some different approaches to what the film version did. And they actually have really notable stars. So they star everyone from Orson Welles to Joseph Cotten, even J. Carrol Naish in some of them. So it's fascinating to hear 3 different approaches to the story, but done in the radio realm. So they're all worth your time, and you get 3 for the price of 1. Then again, the collector's booklet and the limited edition slipcover close out the extras package. So in terms of the overall extras, I think this is the most stuffed of any release to date. I think it's a great supplemental package. The only thing it doesn't have that I wish they'd somehow been able to license, I would love for it to have had the Roan Laserdisc commentary by George Turner, and also probably the best commentary is Bruce Eater's track from Criterion's DVD, but it was probably not possible to license those, which I understand. So I do recommend those other tracks. They are very much worth your time. Eater's track on the Criterion DVD, I think, is the best overall because I always really love his older commentary tracks. So I do recommend those if you get this release and you haven't heard those as well. The Roan Laserdisc also has the really nice full-color booklet that also has a reproduction of original publicity materials. So those were always really lovely in Roan Laserdisc. So it's a nice release to have just for the physical part. But obviously the transfer is nowhere near what the German restoration is. So it's to summarize, I think this is the best overall release of the film to date. I think this is the one to have, and it has the lovely booklet and slipcover and extra features. But the problem is in the audio side of things. You will have to live with either the terrible overscrub restored track or the warts and all unrestored audio option. And it's kind of a shame because the picture is so much improved over everything else. So I do still think this film has not yet had its definitive version available. I think that if somebody put the money in and searched for elements and did a worldwide search and combined all the best elements into a brand new fully restored 4K master and then got every bit of supplements they could, then I think you could have a definitive release. But you're not really going to have somebody wanting to do that and put the money in for something that's in the public domain that anybody can watch online for free, even if it's in the crappiest version possible. So for the time being, this 2K German restoration is the best presentation there is, and now we finally have it in an available version that won't break the bank like the original out-of-print German disc, with nice encoding, lovely new extras, a beautiful new Masters of Cinema limited slipcover and booklet, and it does have the unrestored audio option, which does make the restoration watchable, because again, I think the restored audio is so bad that if you're discerning about audio at all, you're going to notice it, I think, and you're going to want to immediately switch over to the warts and all presentation. So it's unfortunate we have to deal with that in terms of the audio, but at least Eureka went the extra mile to give us an actual audio option that is appropriate, because again, the restored audio is really garbage, I think. So I very much commend Eureka for including the unrestored track, because without that, I would have a very hard time recommending this release, even though it is visually the best version of the film to date, and the extras are great, and the purchase price is rather low. So this is another Masters of Cinema title that I think is a must-own. This is a classic film that deserves to be better known and regarded. It is really shoulder to shoulder with King Kong, its brother film, in terms of being a truly great film. It's just been overshadowed for so long, and it's been stuck in the public domain. So if you want to experience one of the most dramatic hour and 2 minutes you're ever going to have in your life, this is a must-own film. It's a film with insane rewatchability. This is a film you can always come back to and just once again be blown away at how impressively plotted, paced, energetic, creative, and timeless it is. It is one of the immortal classics, I think. It's never been bettered. People have tried to redo this story or rip it off so many times. No one has come close to equaling the power of the original 1932 film adaptation of The Most Dangerous Game, directed by Irving Pichel and Ernest B. Schoedsack, produced by Merian Cooper for RKO. It's one of the 1930s classics. It's a timeless film, and I do think the Eureka Blu-ray is the best release to date, but I do recommend watching it with the unrestored audio option. So those are my thoughts on the MOC Blu-ray release of The Most Dangerous Game. It's unfortunate that it's still imperfect and that it does have the issues with the restored audio. However, overall, I think it is still the best release to date, and I'm amazed we even have a newer release of this German restoration. So now we here in the US and Europe can more easily get our hands on it, because for years I've been regretting the fact that I hadn't got the German disc, but now I'm really glad I didn't because it was expensive. This is a much better release with more extras, of course. And it has the unrestored audio option, because if I had bought that German disc and all it had was the restored audio, yeah, I would have been fuming because it is that bad. Again, definitely look at this with the unrestored track. It's going to be noisy. It has dropouts, but if you know anything about this film's release history and it's being stuck in the public domain, you're going to expect some degree of that. It's never going to be pristine, unfortunately, unless somebody really puts the money and effort into it, which, again, is unfortunately unlikely due to its public domain status. But for the time being, we now finally have a beautiful new Blu-ray edition that is affordable, loaded with new extras, gorgeous packaging. It's a must-own. It's one of the timeless films you can rewatch over and over and over again. And hopefully this causes the film to be appreciated more and discussed more in 2022 and beyond, because it really deserves it. It is a great classic film. And again, for its pacing alone, this is a film that should be studied in film schools. It is one of the most impressively well-paced and tightly edited films you will ever see in your life. And the fact that it is not studied for that fact alone in film schools is amazing, because, again, I can't name a tighter film off the top of my head than the 1932 version of The Most Dangerous Game. It is one of the most tight and dramatic hour and a couple minutes you're ever going to have in your life with a film. It remains timeless and unimproved on. And this is a film you could still go and show in a theater today to a packed house, and every single person in the audience will be amazed and thrilled and want to see it again. And if that's not the mark of a great classic film, I don't know what is. So those are my thoughts on the MOC Blu-ray release. If you have any thoughts about the film or the new Eureka MOC release, please leave them in the comments below. I always love hearing your thoughts about new disc releases as well. And as always, keep supporting studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep physical media and film culture alive. And thanks ever so much for watching. I have to now go prepare for yet another hunt for maybe trying to restore the audio track myself, Rainsford.